On April 5th, 1975, a conference entitled The Central Intelligence Agency and World Peace was held in New Haven, Connecticut on the campus of Yale University. From one of the afternoon workshops of the conference, John Marks, former State Department intelligence officer and co-author of the bestseller The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, discusses the publishing efforts of the CIA within the United States. He also talks about multinational corporations as fronts and sources of operating funds for the Central Intelligence Agency. John Marks.
The CIA's been getting a relatively bad name lately, and in some ways that's just not fair. I mean, especially on the domestic surveillance business. Let's get this thing into perspective. Okay, the CIA had 10,000 files on domestic dissidents, according to the New York Times. I'm perfectly willing to accept Kirk Sale's number of 35,000 files. But then let's turn to the New York City Police Department and its Red Squad, which had 1 million files in one city. And you find in every city in this country of over 50,000 people that there was and is a Red Squad or an intelligence division, or in New York they call it the Bureau of Special Services, but that virtually every police department in this country has a unit, a division, or something like that for surveillance of citizens. In Baltimore, they've got a wonderful scandal going on where members of Congress, local politicians, as well as civil rights and anti-war leaders were surveilled. In Houston, a member of Congress was put under surveillance. There's a similar scandal going on in Dallas, and I'd be willing to bet that in any city where you have somebody who purports to be an investigative reporter, you can turn up that kind of scandal. So there were an awful lot of this surveillance wasn't even being done by the federal government. A lot of it was on the local level. Now, the FBI, as we all know, through the counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO in their language, was doing similar things to disrupt anti-war movements, the civil rights movement. Charming case out at the University of Arizona where a professor named Morris Starsky was up for renewal of his contract, and every member of the tenure committee received an anonymous letter sent by the FBI saying this guy was a really bad fellow and listing all sorts of scurrilous charges. Professor Starsky did not get tenure at University of Arizona. We have the case down in Mississippi where a civil rights leader received an anonymous letter from the FBI that purported to come from something called the Tougaloo Defense Fund. And this civil rights leader was told that he better get out of the state of Mississippi if he wanted to stay alive. And he left the state of Mississippi. That was the FBI that did that kind of thing. And I don't think we've ever seen Ephraim Zimbalist Jr. on Sunday nights writing anonymous letters to get people to leave the state of Mississippi or to get them fired from their jobs. But the FBI was into this in a very heavy way. So when we talk about the CIA and domestic operations, let's keep it in perspective. I mean, the CIA was here, it was doing bad things, it was forbidden by its charter, which is the law, the National Security Act of 1947, from any domestic police or law enforcement or internal security functions. Therefore, everything or virtually everything that the CIA was doing in this country was illegal. However, the illegality was much greater in terms of your local police, the FBI, and maybe another 20 agencies of the federal government. I mean, we even find the Post Office was in it, the Department of Transportation has its own little security police, the Social Security Administration. And they had a wonderful argument in the Senate committee that's looking into intelligence agencies on how many intelligence agencies were there. And I don't know what they finally decided, but I do believe the figure is over 20. So let us keep the CIA role in perspective. Because I think, on the whole, the CIA would just as soon be doing whatever it does overseas. I mean, which is not to say they don't do a lot here and they haven't had a lot of spillover, but these are the guys who kind of are into making events happen around the world. I mean, you know, coups in Chile, presidents in Costa Rica, armed attacks in Indonesia. I mean, it's a very long laundry list. I used that word this morning also. It kind of gives laundries a bad name. But the CIA has been everywhere. But a lot of their support structures and their clandestine structures are based right here in the United States. And let me go into some of those. One of the things that offends me the most is the CIA's literary efforts their book publishing efforts. I mean, there have been books that have appeared regularly in this country that have been subsidized and financed by the good old Central Intelligence Agency. In 1967, Frederick Prager Publishing Company admitted to have published 15 or 16 books for the CIA. Perhaps their most famous literary effort in this country was a book called the Pankowski Papers, which you all might remember went right up to the top of the bestseller list about 1966 or 67 and was supposed to be the journal of this Soviet spy who had spied so courageously for the CIA. Well, I'll tell you, the fastest way to become an ex-spy is to keep a journal. I mean, that just isn't the way the game is played. And Pankowski did not write the Pankowski Papers. What Pankowski did do was send into various Western intelligence officials certain kinds of reports on, I mean, it was high-level Soviet intelligence kind of stuff. After he was captured and executed by the Soviet Union, the CIA wanted to reap a propaganda windfall from this success they had because they've had almost no success against the Soviets anyway. And so the CIA arranged for the publication of this book, put in quite a bit that actually came from Pankowski's reports, and then added a lot of what they call disinformation on top of it. Disinformation is information that sounds like the truth, has truth mixed in it, but also is trying to get across some ideas that just aren't true. And the Pankowski Papers was a fraud. In fact, Pankowski's whole role in the damn thing was a fraud. Because, you know, Pankowski came up to the CIA a few years before he was actually supposed to have become a spy, and Pankowski said to representatives of the CIA, I volunteer, I want to spy for the CIA. I mean, he had his own reasons. They presumably were sincere. The CIA told him, well, you know, we know about all those Russian provocations and tricks and deceptions, and you're just too good to be true, and we don't accept. I mean, we're not going to be fooled again. And then the British recruited Pankowski, I guess the British being a little more cynical or less cynical or whatever. And the British recruited Pankowski, made him a spy, and then told the CIA they had this real hot wire, and would the CIA like to get some of the action? Except the British made the CIA pay for it. They made the CIA furnish satellite photographs, which were coming in through some of our most sensitive sources. So the CIA actually had to pay or blackmail British intelligence in order to get access to the man they had turned down, Mr. Pankowski. And of course, Pankowski is supposedly the CIA's greatest triumph. Well, that's what triumphs are like in the CIA. I like to see some failures. But the point I started off on was the fact that the CIA was propagandizing the American people with the publication of the Pankowski Papers. A similar effort was in 1953 when the MIT Center for Advanced International Studies put out a book called The Dynamics of Soviet Society. There were two versions of that book. One was the classified version, which the CIA got for their own use, and one was the unclassified version, which was published by a good American publishing house and distributed around the country. Walt Rostow participated in the writing of that book. I mean, in other words, Walt Rostow took a CIA subsidy to write a book, or partially write a book, called The Dynamics of Soviet Society, to establish an academic name that brought him into the White House in the 60s and brought us the war in Vietnam and anything else we can blame on Walt Rostow. I mean, I'm exaggerating this point, but the thing is that you do have this incredible movement back and forth from the academic community, certain sections of the academic community, into the U.S. government with CIA overtones, and it's just one big interconnecting web mess kind of thing. As late as 1972, there was a book published by the Center for Advanced International Studies at the University of Miami, which dealt with Latin American problems. CIA operatives contributed to the publication of that book. One was listed as a Foreign Service officer, but he is actually a CIA man who was on the campus at the University of Miami. You're going to find on other American campuses extensive CIA operations. Yale is no exception. I mean, though Yale is the worst case, perhaps, though if I were at Harvard, I might have changed that. I mean, really, it's Yale, Harvard, and Princeton, but Yale does seem to be the worst of all the CIA recruiting grounds. In fact, that undercover agent who Kirk talked about a minute ago, who was in the New York City office, well, he was recruited by William Sloane Coffin into the CIA right off the Yale campus. I mean, good old traditional pattern. You find CIA people on campuses, usually in the form of professors who either served in OSS or had some kind of connection with the CIA, and on a part-time basis do spotting for the CIA. Now, some of this is just to recruit promising young conservative American students of Soviet society to work for the analytical part of the CIA. I mean, good PhD candidates who can be promised that kind of research work in the CIA with access to classified information. I mean, I don't get real excited about that. There's certain questions of academic freedom I might want to get into and everything else, but I'm not going to get real excited about that. You have other professors, American professors on American campuses who are there to spot and recruit foreign students to be spies for the CIA. Why do you recruit them on the Yale campus and not when they get back home? Well, here, there are no local security police. Americans fit in real well. You don't have to disguise yourself with an ill-fitting red wig or anything of that sort. I mean, you can just be, I don't know what you can be. You can name your cover on the Yale campus. You can be virtually anything here. And professors are looking for foreign students, especially bright graduate students from third world countries who, with a little bit of luck and a lot of help from the CIA, have a pretty good chance of rising pretty fast in their governments back home. If they're recruited at Yale, then they're on the payroll forever, and it's just an efficient way of doing it. So foreign students in the United States are a regular target of the Central Intelligence Agency. That one of the things that the Domestic Operations Division does, the CIA's Domestic Operations Division, is to recruit foreigners on American campuses. You have other professors who have entered into secret research contracts and relationships with the CIA. Again, some of this can be on, pretty legitimate kinds of things. I mean, you might have a professor who is studying the future of the wheat crop in the Soviet Union or something like that. Again, I'm not going to get real excited about it, except relationships between college professors and intelligence agencies should probably be a matter of an open matter. I don't like the idea of secret contracts. The contracts get signed with HEW, they get signed with other agencies, the federal government, though they really are CIA contracts. You also find professors on campus doing technical and scientific research, which can vary from developing new little secret writing devices or secret weapons to how you develop a better lens for a satellite camera. Again, classified work under the cover of a contract to another federal government agency, but yet CIA. It's fairly extensive. Now, there's another way that professors can work for the CIA. And I get into this by sort of changing subjects a bit. We've written quite a bit, and Kirk has just talked about it, about the CIA's proprietary network. CIA proprietaries are companies which look or purport to be private, legitimate enterprises, but which in fact are CIA-owned or CIA-controlled. The word they use in the CIA is proprietary, so I'll use that word, and I hope you all understand what I'm talking about. The CIA has several hundred of these proprietary companies operating in the United States and overseas. The most famous ones are the CIA airlines. Air America is the worst kept secret in the entire world. I mean, there are others: Southern Air Transport in Miami, Intermountain Aviation in Tucson, Civil Air Transport in Taiwan. I could probably go on. No, I can't go on because I'm under injunction, but there are other CIA air proprietaries. And these companies are very, very profitable because the way you build up cover if you're an airline is to act like an airline. I mean, that's a truism. And that means chartering your planes to people who want them. So the CIA has one of the largest charter businesses in the world. They charter their planes to other government agencies and to private companies. For instance, in the 1971 Bangladesh thing, when the United States, with all its humanitarian concern, was sending grain to Bangladesh, who got the contract from AID? Southern Air Transport, a CIA proprietary. I believe that one was worth $2 million. The mechanics of underbidding for a government contract when you have a CIA proprietary up against Trans World Airlines, which may or may be anyway. When you have a CIA airline bidding against a real private airline, I mean, I just don't know how that works, but I bet you could write some conflict of interest stories that don't stop. I mean, the possibilities for inside deals are incredible. I talked to a former vice president of one of the CIA airlines whose experience was in the early 1950s. And he told me in about 1952 or 1953, the CIA had 17 operational airlines in the United States. And one of the things they were doing was flying American GIs on their way to Korea from the East Coast to the West Coast. And you start thinking about this. I mean, why couldn't a Pan Am or Eastern have had that contract? Especially because the CIA airline was using Air Force planes which were being loaned to it. And the only reason one can think of is that the Defense Department was just shoving money over into the CIA. The CIA was literally earning a profit on the open market. Well, the airlines earn money from other government agencies. They earn money from legitimate private charters. Bobby Baker got in trouble because he flew a CIA airline on what he thought was a private charter, and that's how he first came to the attention of government prosecutors back in the late 60s. But the point I'm really trying to get at is the CIA is a profit-making business in itself. It has revenues coming in from these companies that exceed $200 million a year. It has a holding company called the Pacific Corporation that owns Air America, Air Asia, and a few of the others. The Pacific Corporation last year declared revenues of $48 million. That was domestic operations. They fly more overseas than they do in this country. So I can conceive of a time in this country where Congress might even cut the CIA appropriation, and the CIA would say, well, that's okay, we'll just increase our business-making potential. I mean, they have a source of outside income. Again, the Constitution, that outmoded document that it is, says that, and I say that sarcastically because it's not, but the Constitution says only the Congress shall appropriate funds. It says nothing about government agencies raising their own funds on the private market. And I think you're going to find, and the press will be finding, as the CIA scandal further unfurls, that the next area of major concern is going to be the CIA's financial dealings. The CIA has been investing in the stock market. The CIA has been using money that comes in through these commercial ventures in all sorts of ways that a lot of people in the press do not yet understand, but it's being worked on. And I think we're going to find some conflict of interest that don't stop when we get into this kind of thing. I mean, just to give you a nice little example, Southern Air Transport was for years the CIA's air intervention arm in Latin America. And 2 years ago, the CIA decided it wanted to sell it off, mainly because its cover, I think, had been blown so terribly. And so who did they want to sell it to? They started to sell the company to the president of the company. In other words, the chief operating officer of Southern Air Transport, the president, Stanley Williams, was buying the company from the CIA. And you talk about an inside deal. I mean, I think that is the definition of an inside deal. And the Miami Herald just had an article about this about 2 weeks ago, and they pointed out that Stanley Williams paid $2.1 million, the president now he is, Stanley Williams paid $2.1 million to buy Southern Air Transport, which had assets of over $4 million. And, you know, they get away with this kind of stuff because no one pays any attention. Well, I think some legal action is going to be taken against that particular transaction, but it also indicates this pattern of kind of inside business dealings, which sometimes are tied directly into American corporations, as Kirk Sale pointed out to you with the Hughes connections, but often the CIA can accomplish their objectives within their own businesses. And these businesses do some really interesting kinds of stuff. We discovered one. I was working with Taylor Branch of Harper's Magazine, and we've written about this, so I mean, I don't know, I mean, it's not totally new stuff. But we discovered a police training school about 2 blocks off DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. And for you who don't know it, the whole anti-war movement was located within those 2 blocks. I mean, all headquarters of every anti-war organization were around DuPont Circle. So was the CIA's private police training school, which was called International Police Services Incorporated, or as they called it, IMPULSE. Well, that's an acronym for the initials. Impulse trained thousands of foreign policemen in the United States who supposedly had come here for private training. During that time, when they were at Impulse, specialized CIA trainers would teach people in bugging techniques, wiretapping techniques, surveillance techniques, and things of that sort. For those of you who heard what I said this morning, that same Uruguayan police captain who kept turning up his radio was sent to Impulse and got some of his training right there, right off DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C. And so we all had been ranting and raving for the last few years about something called the International Police Academy, which was run by the Agency for International Development, and there had been a lot of charges about CIA involvement. Well, those charges about CIA involvement in the International Police Academy were perfectly true. The CIA was behind the setting up of the International Police Academy. But the thing was, there was another school just as big as the International Police Academy, located about 12 blocks away, which was doing the same thing, but even more secretly because there was no open U.S. government contact. And that's why the CIA sets up its private companies, because it gets another degree of cover, another layering away from the real source. I discovered another one of these companies in Washington, D.C. on Connecticut Avenue, which was called Psychological Assessment Associates. I wrote about that one in Rolling Stone last summer. And Psychological Assessment Associates was a company that was doing psychological research. And it was doing research in a field you may never have heard about in your psych courses, because it was called Indirect Assessment. And that is the art of making judgments about people, or testing people who do not know they're being tested, which has not too much validity in the laboratory, but has a lot of validity in the espionage world, where you don't want to tell people that they're being tested as you're recruiting them for a spy or trying to decide whether they're telling the truth. And what these people were doing at Psychological Assessment Associates, the CIA front, was looking for correlations between certain kinds of behavior patterns and certain kinds of things like whether they were telling the truth or whether there were vulnerabilities with the person. And just to give you a ridiculous example, I mean, the kinds of things they were doing was looking for twitches and where people parted their hair and how they reacted to certain kinds of jokes and things of that sort. I mean, kind of the way you wear your hair, the way you are tonight, said the CIA. And they would try and correlate all these things together and then make a judgment if a foreigner was vulnerable to women or men or drugs or alcohol or whatever. And it was great for this psychological work for this espionage work that they were trying to do. This gets me back to my college professors, because the reason you use a company like Psychological Assessment Associates is so you can get research from regular, straight college professors who don't have to tell their colleagues, yeah, I'm doing psychological research for the CIA. They say, I'm doing it for this Washington consulting firm called Psychological Assessment Associates. So, I mean, one thing I would suggest any budding investigators out there to do is each time a CIA front is exposed, try and find out if there's anyone around who's ever doing business with them. Because these organizations were being used as cutouts, as separation from the main CIA. And a lot of the information concerning CIA activities ties into these companies rather than directly into the CIA. And as an investigator, I can tell you that once you start unraveling the CIA network, you find out it very easily unravels, because you find out that the director of one company is serving on the board of another company, and you sit there with a Dun & Bradstreet $1 million directory, and you literally can kind of spot the CIA companies from the people you know who were in the CIA and get them from one to the next. So the CIA's domestic operations in this country were not inconsiderable. An area which no one has touched on, and I've been given an ultimatum to get off, but an area which I do want to touch on is the fact that certain ethnic communities in this country were considered fair game for the CIA. That meant anybody who came from anywhere in Eastern Europe, a Pole, a Ukrainian, an Estonian, Cubans, Arab Americans, but large sectors of the American population were thought to be legitimate targets for the CIA because they might potentially have some connections to the homeland. Well, as far as I know, they never went after English Americans or German Americans or some of the Western Europeans. But the Eastern Europeans were fair game for the CIA. Their communities and their organizations in this country were and still are regularly penetrated by the CIA. The CIA seems to have a dual concept of what American citizenship is. If you come from a country we don't like so much now, you can be spied upon. If you come from a country which is one of our allies in the English-speaking Union, then they leave you alone, on ethnic grounds. But that's something that shouldn't be forgotten. We probably don't have too many Estonian Americans in the room, but if I were an Estonian American, I'd be damn mad about it. I mean, there was a charming court case in Baltimore a few years ago where one Estonian slandered another Estonian. These are all Americans now, Estonian Americans. One slandered another, and the guy who did the slandering went into court and said, my defense is that I was ordered to do it by the CIA. And sure enough, then Deputy Director Helms submitted an affidavit saying, yes, we ordered this one Estonian to slander the other Estonian because the second Estonian was a KGB agent, except they were all Americans. I mean, this was crazy. But the judge said, oh, that's okay, as long as you had an order from the director of CIA, and he threw the case out. Now, presumably that wouldn't happen today, though I wouldn't bet on it, having had my own experience with the federal judiciary. But at least the climate is improving. Okay, the overall point is the CIA does an awful lot in this country, and I'm off.
For more information on the Central Intelligence Agency, contact Center for National Security Studies, 122 Maryland Avenue, Northwest, Washington, D.C., 2002. This program was produced at radio station WWUH in West Hartford, Connecticut.